So I think most of you know our mission statement by heart by now, but researching, preserving, and promoting the history and culture of Knoxville, Tennessee. That's what we do every day. I also want to, remind you that we have, if you go to our website, Knoxville History Project, and go to the Engage section at the top, and down the bottom, click on History Happy Hour. We have many of these Zooms within recorded sessions, recorded Zooms, and all these categories. And I think we have at least 60 sessions recorded. So if you want to think about that as kind of your own, or KHP's own little Netflix free TV show, please enjoy. Also, thank you everyone who's made a donation this year to support this nonprofit that allows us to do this type of work and the books and other programs that we do. But if you've not donated recently, please consider making a donation. I think it's worth your while to help us continue this. It would not happen without a nonprofit doing it. Temperatures have dropped a little bit. If you've got friends, visitors, or daughters or sons or grandchildren coming into town, already live here, and you've not done a walk around town and learned some great history with Laura Still, I encourage you to do that. Visit Laura at knoxvillewalkingtours.com. And a donation of the tours that she does downtown support the Knoxville History Project. So thank you, Laura. So tonight, Destination Knoxville, History of Vacationing in the Queen City of the Appalachians with Jack. We received a grant recently, which we are very appreciative to the Arts and Culture Alliance for administering this locally, but it's funding through the Department of the Treasury, and again, organized by the Arts and Culture Alliance, as well as the City of Knoxville. So thanks for all those three organizations and entities that are giving us some great funding to underwrite the programs and research stuff that we do for the next 12 months. So thanks for that. And now I'm going to hand it back over to Jack.
All right, thanks very much, Paul, and thanks everybody for joining us, and thanks to Nicole for making this, helping us make this happen. But this is, of course, the World's Fair anniversary year, and the 40th anniversary of the World's Fair. And I actually have I've been saving my World's Fair beer for 40 years just to just for this evening to talk about the history of tourism in Knoxville. That was the single biggest tourist event in Knoxville history, and I have to say I'm a little bit disappointed with the taste of this beer after 40 years, which has actually not improved from what it was in 1982, which was not all that impressive anyway. But anyway, it's us historians have to do silly things sometimes. But we're talking about the history of tourism. If the World's Fair was the biggest single event in history, in terms of tourism in Knoxville, it was not the only one. In fact, there have been many reasons that a lot of different people have come here for various purposes, and I want to talk about some of them first. In fact, Knoxville is only a few days old when it had what I think is our first tourist, and it's remarkable that our first tourist that I know of, our first tourist on record, was a very famous guy in France. His name was René Chateaubriand. He was a viscount, I believe, at the time. And I hope someone paints a picture like me of me that way someday. But that's the man himself. He was a French statesman, but also a novelist. And he was one of several French nobles who found it expedient for their personal safety to come to America in the 1790s for reasons you might guess. If you know anything about French history, that was the Reign of Terror. And lots of French noblemen were coming abroad just to save their own necks. And Chateaubriand was one of them. And while they were here, they kind of took the grand tour of America. And in the 1790s, the grand tour often included Knoxville. Not because Knoxville was a very impressive place, it was just a tiny little settlement, just barely incipient sort of capital of the Southwestern Territory. But it was the nearest town with taverns to the Cherokee villages, and that was fascinated many Europeans who came to America, and they would stay in Knoxville just for the chance to ride for a day or two and get to the Cherokee villages, which were along the Little Tennessee, the place where all those little towns were, where people like Sequoia were born. In fact, Sequoyah was a young man when Chateaubriand came from Knoxville to the Cherokee villages and visited them. There's a bit of controversy among literary scholars about whether Chateaubriand actually did a lot of the things that he reported in his journal that he did. And many people have said was a complete lie, because in the journal, it indicates that Chateaubriand seemed to go from Knoxville to Chillicothe, is the way he spelled it. And they assume that meant Chillicothe, Ohio, in just one day, which would have been impossible in those days. But a scholar went through very creatively, went through and reassembled Chateaubriand's diary, two-century-old diary, and noticed that that it was pierced with a kind of triangular staple, which showed where the pages should have lay. And he reassembled the pages and found out that if only we change one thing, if he mistook the word teleco for what he thought in a French pronunciation might be Chillicothe, so Chillicothe versus teleco, that it all makes sense, that he really did go from Knoxville to this place, but it wasn't Chillicothe, it was teleco. So that was I tend to believe that he actually did come here. And he mentions Knoxville in his novel called Atala, which is much better known, or was much better known in Europe than it ever was in America. But it's a novel, a very romantic, fanciful novel based on the Cherokee Indians, which he revered and was fascinated with. So this is arguably our very first tourist of any sort. Doesn't look like a tourist as we come to expect them. But he was one of several noblemen who came from Paris very deliberately to get away from Paris for a while when the guillotine was there. And another was a guy named Louis Philippe, who was later the citizen king of France. But an interesting guy who was here for a bit and actually remembered it many years later when he talked to visiting diplomats and talked about how they would sleep several people to a bed in Tennessee. He's believed to have at least visited William Blount in downtown Knoxville, and there's actually a picture of him on the wall at Blount Mansion. But another Frenchman, interesting other guy who grew up among nobles is André Michaud, who was different from the other guys. He grew up actually was born and raised at Versailles and knew the king, King Louis XV, but became his father was the royal arborist. He became a botanist, but he became also a revolutionary. So he was on the opposite side of Chateaubriand and Louis Philippe. But he was in Knoxville working sometimes as an agent for the revolutionary government in France. But he was here mainly, perhaps once as a secret agent, but he was here in Knoxville 3 or 4 times in the 1790s, mostly as a botanist who was fascinated with the fascinating diversity of wildlife here in East Tennessee. And his name appears in the Latin names of some plants and shrubs and flowers and things. But he had a fascinating life. I think he died in Madagascar or something. He was just had a global career, although he was based in Charleston at the time he came to Knoxville several times. But anyway, there are several interesting people who came through here. The tiny, almost inconsiderable village of a couple hundred people, but because it was the capital and because it was a place with taverns, a lot of these famous Frenchmen came through here at that time, partly just to behold the place. What's the next one, Paul? We have and here's a later picture of it, but this is one of our first very permanent hostelries. The other early places where people stayed were taverns, like the famous Chisholm's Tavern, which was one of about 7 taverns in Knoxville in the 1790s. But by 1816, 1817, we built this, what became known later as the Lamar House. And if this looks vaguely familiar, this is the front of the Bijou Theater today. It doesn't have the roof and gable anymore on top of it, but that's the same, basically the same shell of a building that forms the front of the Bijou Theater. This was the most popular hotel in Knoxville in the pre-Civil War era, and there are lots and lots of stories about people spending time there, and some people being killed there. But Andrew Jackson was feted there after his victory in New Orleans. But lots and lots of stories about that one building. But next one, there was a time Knoxville was the capital of the Southwestern Territory, and then Tennessee, and then went into a fallow period when it just kind of moldered for some years. And nobody who came to Knoxville in the 1830s and 40s was very impressed with the place, but especially the 1830s, which is when a guy originally from England came here, just making a tour through America. His name was George Fanshawe, is how I'm told it was pronounced. It looks like an unpronounceable bunch of syllables there, but he was a British geologist, was much respected in Britain and also in America. But he came to Knoxville and described it as in 1834 as a poor, neglected looking place, which notwithstanding, and it sounds very droll, which notwithstanding makes a great feature on the map. He's saying Knoxville looks very impressive on the map, but not when you get there. So that was his assessment of Knoxville. Interestingly, he stayed at Campbell Station on the west side of town. And while he was there, he walked in and saw a man sitting there by himself smoking a pipe, and realized it was the President of the United States. His description of Andrew Jackson is often quoted because it was one of the most colorful descriptions of Jackson of that era, and also it was, I think, one of the very few descriptions of Jackson in his home state, because he spent most of his time in Washington during his presidency. It's just remarkable that one famous geologist would walk into a tavern on the west side of town and encounter the President of the United States. But Knoxville is a place that had very little appeal to tourists. I'd like to mention that when the Swiss first arrived in the 1840s, they were enthralled mainly by the fact that they'd never seen lightning bugs before. And when they took the river trip up from Chattanooga to Knoxville, that was one thing that they noted. Knoxville began to change a lot in 1855 when the first trains arrived. The very first train arrived in Knoxville in 1855, and nothing was ever the same after that. In fact, a novel that has a brief Knoxville setting in 1859 was written by Sidney Lanier, the well-known Georgia poet. This is a picture of him, and his only novel is called Tiger Lilies. And it opens with a scene in Knoxville among German tourists who have arrived here not to come to Knoxville. Their names are Gretchen and Ottilie, two German women, but they get off the train in Knoxville, stay at a hotel, probably the Lamar House, interestingly, which was owned by Sidney Lanier's family. But then they took some carriages to another place that was also connected to Sidney Lanier's family, and that was a place called Montvale, which was one of the several Springs resorts in Knoxville. I'm going to talk about Springs resorts later, but Montvale, you may know, it was a YMCA camp for many years. I went there, it was a YMCA camp, and there were still the old stone steps to the hotel that had burned many years before. And the old, I don't know how old it was, but the old gazebo was there when I was a kid, and that was where the bands would play in the evenings at Montvale. But this is where a lot of this book, this very strange novel, takes place. It has to do with a masquerade at Montvale, and it's kind of a high anxiety time because it's right at the very beginning of the Civil War that this is set. Anyway, but Sidney Lanier was a poet, but his family made their money from the tourism business. There's a great description, by the way, of the Tennessee River down in one of the markers down on Volunteer Landing, written by Sidney Lanier, about how the river flows down from the mountains, and it talks about the mountains sitting like dethroned kings assembled for consultation. But a fascinating a fascinating story. Walt, I probably knew your uncle then, because I was swimming was not my favorite thing there, but it was they were real disciplinarians about swimming, and I tended to try to run out in the woods and hope they wouldn't notice that I wasn't at the swimming lesson. But I don't know if your uncle was the tough guy that I was trying to get away from. But anyway, we don't really see a lot of tourism, like casual tourism in Knoxville, until after the Civil War. And this, a couple of things affected that. One was the fact that suddenly we had train travel, and Knoxville was central to a major American railroad, and that was the East Tennessee, Virginia, and Georgia Railroad. And Paul, we have a map of that that shows how really amazingly connected this was. This is it connected to the Gulf Coast and all over the South up to Cincinnati. So this was a big deal, and it was headquartered in Knoxville. And so a lot of people could get here from a lot of different places, and a lot of people had reason to come here as it happens. But Knoxville was central to the most populous part of the nation then as now, and we had a lot of people passing through, some people coming here, but a lot of people passing through, some of them laying over, some of them staying on the train, but seeing Knoxville from the windows. A lot of accidental tourism of people just passing through here. And I'd like to mention that on Gay Street, there's a building that has a Knox Heritage plaque on it that says Lost McGee Library Rabori Building. It was the long story I won't tell tonight, but it was that their name Rabori is that of Fiorenzo Rabori, who was an Italian immigrant who ended up owning that building in 1915. And that's why it's called the Rabori Building today. But he was here as an accidental tourist. He was on his way to Memphis on the train and was held up by the fact that the trains were snowed, that the rails outside of Knoxville were snowed under. So he was stuck here for a while and began talking to some other Italians, and they said, "This is a pretty good business town. Why don't you set up here?" So he became a kind of a peanut and fruit vendor down next to the building that there was the library there. So that's why it became known as the Rabori Building. But he was just like an accidental tourist who ended up here accidentally, had nothing better to do than to stay in Knoxville, and did very well with his life. But we had several hotels. People started coming here for business, especially for business. That was a lot of salespeople, industrialists, investors came to Knoxville in this booming time when the city was growing really, really fast in the later years when we had lots of industry. I'll talk about some of the industry later. But we had several hotels, including the Hattie House at Game Clinch, which became, I think, had a radical conversion, was much expanded, and became a hotel called the Imperial Hotel. We have a picture of that. This was probably the best hotel in Knoxville in the 1890s and very early 1900s. It was, as I mentioned when I was asked on the radio today, whether Knoxville had any experience with lightning, because we had a lot of lightning last night, didn't we? This hotel was struck by lightning in 1916 and burned down. And it was replaced by the Farragut, which we now know is Hyatt Place. But that's been a hostelry since that corner since the 1880s. But that was probably the single best hotel. Here's next one is the Atkin House, and this was built in 1910. This was a really grand, big hotel that was right near the train station. And if you can imagine this fitting into into what used to be the parking lot for Regus Restaurant, and now is part of Regus Square, that's where it is. And there was another hotel to the left of it. That's the Watauga to the left of it, which is where Regus actually was built later. But this is that was the size of tourism in Knoxville by 1910. Of course, a lot of people were just off the train. Some of them were just staying overnight, waiting for another train. But that was kind of the train station hotel, and had lots of interesting. Walter Damrosch, the famous conductor, came there once. William Howard Taft, the president, gave a speech in that hotel in 1911. But Bertha Walburn Clark began her career that eventually led to the Knoxville Symphony Orchestra in that building. She had a small string quartet there back in those early days at the hotel. They were just played there all the time in the lobby. So that was this hotel was there until it was torn down in the early 1960s, I believe, but was kind of run down by the time it got to that point. Time tends to be hard on hotels. But also we had one of the big draws for tourism, not just in the Knoxville area, but across America, were the Springs resorts. I think by the late 20th century, we were talking about the beach vacation, but in the late 19th century, it was you went to a Springs resort, and this the idea was to go to a place out in the country that was known for its springs, and sometimes these springs had medicinal properties or were purported to. Sometimes they were just nice places to hang out. Resorts that had big porches and places to read and walk and that sort of thing. But we had several of those in the area. We mentioned Montvale and Water Lilies, but people would go there and take the waters or whatever. Yeah, here's a Montvale, I guess, in one of its. I think not the original hotel, but a early 20th century hotel. This is probably the one that had the steps that were still there after it burned down in the 30s, I believe. But anyway, it was that was probably one of the first, because it went back to the 1830s. It was there for about a century. But also there are several others that advertised in Knoxville papers and even in New York papers. People would come here from all over the country to go to the Springs resorts. There are probably a dozen of these. What's the next one, Paul? We have a picture of the Fountainhead. This is the Fountainhead Hotel in Fountain City. This was probably one of the biggest resorts in what we consider Knoxville proper today. This was outside of Knoxville in those days, but the Fountain City was considered much cleaner than Knoxville. Knoxville was a dirty place, and because of all the smoke from the factories and the coal burning furnaces in people's houses, people would go up to Fountain City where everything was clean and there was no alcohol and it was all there. No bars. It was morally clean, and the air was clean and the water was clean in Fountain City, and that was what made it so wonderful and made so many people want to go there. But the Fountainhead Hotel was a big deal in the 1880s and 90s. If you go up to Fountain City today, the what we known as a duck pond or a Fountain City Lake, whichever you prefer, that heart-shaped pond was built as an amenity for the hotel, and that's all that remains of the hotel today, besides the name Hotel Avenue that's very near there. So that's that Fountain City was founded as a resort, as a tourist resort, and it was for many years. Not many people actually lived there. People just visited, and it was just a fun place to go. Of course, Fountain City Park was also part of that, and Knoxvillians and also people from other parts of the country would go there. But we have what's the next one, Paul? Is it? Yeah, here's Fountain City Park. That lake or pond that I'm just talking about is there. I'm always amazed that people fish in there and get big catfish sometimes out of that pond. But Tate Spring was one of the most famous in the Knoxville area. It was pretty far out. It was probably 30 or 40 miles out of town, but was you see that celebrated Tate Spring Epsom water is what that was their calling card. But the Carlsbad of America, that was I'm interested to know exactly what that meant at that time. But that was something in the Knoxville area that was much talked about. And of course Whittle Springs. This was also in what's now Knoxville, but was out of town, up near Fountain City. And of course, probably where Whittle Springs Golf Course is today. That was built for this hotel. It was built around 1915, I believe, and was still a big deal well into the early 20th century. Had an enormous swimming pool, but some people, they had jazz orchestras playing for dances. There's including some kind of really well-known jazz orchestras, Jack Teagarden and several interesting, well-known jazz folks performed there over the years. But also people would live there for indefinitely for months or years. Just a kind of an idyllic place. I'm sorry, it was torn down in the early 1960s. It seemed like we tore down a lot of stuff in the early 60s. Next one, please. Right, here's Newbert Springs, and some of you may know, some of you may recognize this building in the foreground, the gazebo, which is still there. It's a gazebo built of some interesting kind of twisted roots. It's a really rare sort of a building. But this is Newbert Springs when the big resort hotel was still there, and they were one of the last Springs resorts to be really doing a big business in Knoxville. They were really booming in the 1920s, and it was a place that you could get away with a lot of stuff. You could go to Newport Springs, and they'd probably have some liquor on hand there, and also would have jazz bands often playing in that gazebo. But would love to know more about the history of Newport Springs. Not too far from. It's off if you can get there off of John Sevier Highway. If you go south from there, it's not too far from the John Sevier home site, Marble Springs. But anyway, what were all these people coming here to see besides just resorts and springs resorts? There were several random attractions in town. One of them was what was the next one, Paul? Is it? This is the UT Indian Burial Mound, as it was known at the time. It was and it's still there today. I'm really glad to say it's surrounded by buildings today. But this was what was known as the UT Farm at one time, and I found some just a little background. Indian mounds were around, and people just didn't think much about them. They sometimes built houses on top of them. They were just kind of an interesting remnant of some other culture, but people began digging into them to see what was there. And there's fantastic stories in the Victorian era of people finding the skeletons of giants in Indian mounds. They thought they were some pre-Native American race that lived here. And the things that they found, it's kind of frustrating to think of now that people would just dig into them, but they thought that was a good and worthwhile thing to dig into these Indian mounds and learn about what was there. And it's I always pictured the pillagers as being these just crazy rednecks looking for gold, and some of them were. There were rumors that there was gold in Indian mounds, and there never was. But some of these people, looking into research, a lot of these people were official so-called scientists from Washington and the Smithsonian or the Philadelphia Academy of Science, who were coming here, and they were just digging in here, and they would collect all the stuff they found and put it in a box and take it back to Philadelphia or somewhere and probably display it for a month or two and then put it back in a box, and who knows what the context is of all the things that they found in the Indian mounds of Tennessee and many other states that they looked into. We don't know. I don't know for sure. How much, whether this one's been dug into. I imagine it has been, because it's the closest one to downtown, the closest one to where people lived. So surely people were curious about it, but it's actually more intact than the other one on Cherokee Boulevard. And it's believed to be more than 1,000 years old. And there are believed to be burial mounds right along the river. But these were described by several people over the years. In 1902, an Indian mound was described as one of Knoxville's leading tourist attractions. This description: College Farm on the Kingston Pike car line is a beautiful place. Near the center of the farm is a large Indian mound covered with trees of many kinds. But this was, it's interesting how they would describe places in terms of streetcar lines, as if they were, and there are actually some descriptions of streetcar lines as tourist trolleys. If you want to take a streetcar line to see Fort Sanders, they would talk about where Fort Sanders, the ruin of Fort Sanders was, and what you would see along the way. These were things that were published, and who knows how many tourists actually used them that way. But I think it's a good way to present your city, to show what you're going to see out the window of practical transportation. Next one, Paul. Here's the Deaf and Dumb Asylum, which was probably what they called the School for the Deaf, with no offense intended in those days. But this was kind of famous when they built it in 1848. This was one of the first deaf schools in America, and this was one of the landmarks of Knoxville. even before the Civil War, but soon after too. And it made lists of tourist sites to see. A fairly impressive building. I'm glad it's still there as LMU College of Law, and just I can see it from out my window here. But that's one of our older buildings downtown. Next one, Paul. One thing that people traveled a lot to see was industry. America was booming. America was proud of its industry. And when people went on trips, they didn't always go to spas or to gamble or whatever people might do today. They wanted to see industry in action in America. And Knoxville had lots of options for that. Knoxville was kind of famous for marble, this amazing colored marble that people had never seen before the 1870s, when it really became a kind of a national thing, when it was kind of shown at the Philadelphia World's Fair. But this was what people wanted to come and see Tennessee marble and being mined sometimes and being processed in the marble mills. And it's remarkable that you could just walk in. Tourists could seemingly just walk up to a marble mill and find someone in charge, and they would show them how it operated. I can't imagine going to any factory today and expecting to get the security guard to let you see anything. But this was marble was a big deal. Knoxville's a marble city. And this was something that Knoxville was kind of famous for by the 1870s and 80s and beyond. So this was one of them. The Brooklyn Times Union in 1895 said Knoxville is the richest town of its population in the South. It is even more Western and modern in its makeup than Atlanta. It has the greatest marble mills in the country, and its shipping interests are as great as the hospitality of its people. It's a nice thing to say, isn't it, for New Yorkers? Anyway, this was really a tourist draw, the whole marble industry. Next one, Paul. All right, here's Knoxville Woolen Mills, and this was really, look at it, this building. It's covered with ivy deliberately, just like an Ivy League school or a church or something in England. But this is a beautiful building, and it was believed to be one of the biggest woolen mills in the world, is what they said. This was located down to the north of Fort Sanders, down in the valley down there by the train tracks, where all the sports fields are today. But of course, nothing lasts forever. These buildings, obviously, these factories were made to look at. This looks like a cathedral or a church. Doesn't it? But that was the way people thought in the 1880s through the 1920s, that you would build architectural edifices to see where they made things, and this is where they made or prepared wool for weaving and so forth. But this is, of course, nothing lasts. By the 1960s, I think it had closed, and we actually have a picture of it in ruins in the very early 1970s. These pictures taken by Ross Mall of the old Knoxville Woolen Mills as just before it was demolished. Anyway, that's that. But also other mills, very famous at one time was Brookside Mills, which was on the north side of town. If you know Happy Holler was where the many thousands of people who worked at Brookside Mills went to entertain themselves. They went to the movie theater and the bars and grocery shops and bakeries at Happy Holler. But Brookside Mills was, it's all gone now, but it was over near where the interstate is now, 275, just to the west of Happy Holler on North Central there. But this was a big deal, and it's also what brought Clarence Brown's family to Knoxville. He was born in Massachusetts, but they came to Knoxville to work at Brookside Mills. But these all these industries were proud of themselves, and Knoxville's proud of them, and they actually did draw tourists to the city, and also investors, of course. But another thing people came to Knoxville for, and that was talked about a lot, is Civil War tourism. Even though Knoxville didn't have a big battle like Chattanooga or Gettysburg or a lot of other cities did, It had some interesting and unique aspects to the war that actually drew people, especially for special events. And Paul, if we look at the next slide, in 18, yeah, well, there was another mill there, right? But this was, I'm sorry, the Coster shops. I should have mentioned that they were the big Southern Railway shops, and I wanted to mention these because I found a tourist guide that said all school teachers in America will want to see the Coster shops of Knoxville. That apparently was a very impressive operation there, and people would go just to behold it. But this is where they did the servicing for all the Southern Railway freight and passenger cars. Would refit them, would build them, would do all the work on them there. But the Coster shops, Southern Railway was so powerful that if you go north on, it's mostly gone now, but if you go north on I-275, it bows way over to the west. You've probably seen that and wondered why. You didn't mind taking a interstate right through a residential neighborhood, and that happened in Knoxville and lots of places. But you didn't want to touch anything that was owned by Southern Railway, so they had to put the interstate all the way around the Coster shops when they built it in the early 1960s, I think. But yeah, that was it was a very big deal. But yeah, next one now, Paul. Yeah, I was talking about Civil War tourism, and of course, one of the things people wanted to see when they came to Knoxville in the 1880s and 90s was Fort Sanders, which was very decisively repelled a massive Confederate attack in 1863. It's since become, I think, less famous than it was then. But people would come here and want to see the ruins of Fort Sanders. And if you notice this little street down at the bottom of that circle around the actual Fort Sanders as it appeared in 1885, which is when this drawing was made, that street which approximates 17th Street is called Fort Sanders Avenue. It goes right up to the fort. So a lot of people went there, but this was especially dramatic when they had one of our biggest tourist events in history in the 19th century was the Blue-Gray Reunion, in which who thought this idea would work it sounds crazy, but invite everybody who was a veteran of a battle that everybody was trying to kill each other, invite both sides to come to a big camp meeting, more or less, of several days in the city that one was trying to defend and the other was trying to invade, and have them all together and bring them out to the fort, have them camping together out there, and have fireworks above the fort. That was what they did, and that was a huge event. They did this actually twice in the 1890s. That was really something, but it was just probably the most dramatic of the Civil War tourist events, but not the only one. A lot of people came for other purposes. Next one, Paul. To see other things in Knoxville. One of them was that you see recommended in many northern papers for people planning a trip to Knoxville is to see the National Cemetery. And this is a national cemetery established during the Civil War as an emergency of war by General Ambrose Burnside, and is still unchanged except for the addition of lots more graves. It still has the unusual, maybe unique concentric circle design, and with a flag right in the middle, and also this monument, which has been called, and I haven't found any reason to doubt it, the biggest Union monument that's not on a national battlefield in the South. And this is something people like to come out and have a look at. Even 110 years ago. This was originally built in 1901. You probably know the story about it was struck by lightning and then rebuilt in 1903. But I'm glad to say still there and still worth having a look at today. But it's remarkable how little that National Cemetery really is a relic of the Civil War and has not changed much at all since then, except for the addition of about 6,000 more graves from other wars after that. Let's see. But also, and this is pretty surprising to people, that a lot of people said the one thing you got to see in Knoxville, and in fact, some people said this was Knoxville's main claim to fame, was a house, a frame house on East Cumberland Avenue. That's not there today. It's been a long. I've never met anybody who remembers seeing it. It's torn down a long time ago. But it was the house that had once belonged to Parson Brownlow, Parson W.G. Brownlow. And here's a kind of a postcard-like picture of it. This was the house where Parson Brownlow lived. What made it famous? Parson Brownlow was for one thing, he was the editor of the Knoxville Whig, which is a very hardcore unionist paper that remained in business even during Confederate occupation. And he, during Confederate occupation, he defied Confederate troops by raising his U.S. flag. Here's a 60-year-old man out raising a U.S. flag, even when the occupying troops are in town, marching up and down Gay Street. And they kind of tolerated him for a while, finally jailed him. But he was shot at in this house. He had a lot of problems. But later, of course, he became governor of Tennessee. And as governor of Tennessee was I think our most influential governor. People say our most hated governor, and he was to some people. But he was he extended the right of vote to black men before black men in the North could vote in most states. I think Tennessee was only the 6th state in America to allow black men to vote because of Parson Brownlow. And this is even as he was denying the vote to former Confederates. But he passed, sometimes using extraordinary tactics, the 13th and 14th Amendments through the Tennessee legislature in Nashville. These are the 14th Amendment, especially, was very controversial even in the North, which guaranteed kind of full protection, equal protection under the law. Parson Brownlow made this all happen. He became kind of a legend, especially in the North and even in other countries. When he died in 1877, he got obituaries all over America, in the Northeast, the Midwest, and even in England. There were obituaries for Parson Brownlow in England. Talk about what an amazing story his was. But his house remained here after his death, and his wife, Eliza, remained here as a widow for almost 40 years after his death. And his house was a place that was visited by every Republican president who ever came to town. McKinley, Teddy Roosevelt talked about Brownlow, and William Howard Taft came here. All of them came and talked to Parson Brownlow's widow, even in the 20th century. This was, but also apparently from several random descriptions, hundreds, if not thousands, of just random tourists would come here and knock on the door, and Eliza Brownlow, at the age of 80 or so, would answer the door and be happy to talk to people about what she remembered about the Civil War and how scary that was, really, when you're living in a wooden house and your husband's raising the enemy flag outside every day. But people really admired Eliza Brownlow, who died here in 1914. And I'm sorry to say that after her death, people kind of forgot about the house. It was torn down in the mid-1920s for an apartment building to be built, and the apartment building was torn down 30, 40 years later. Now it's somewhere in the James White Parkway vicinity. Anyway, it's that was one of here's a description of Parson Brownlow's house from someone in Ohio, from Xenia, Ohio. I think the city is more known over the North as the old home of Parson Brownlow. This is from 1898. As the old home of Parson Brownlow than for any other cause. I have had the pleasure of 2 extended interviews with the widow of Parson Brownlow and found her a most interesting person indeed. This is, as far as I know, was just a guy from Ohio who went up and knocked on her door and wanted to talk to her. And there might be hundreds of other stories like that. Anyway, it was in New York Times in 1911, and this is preparing people for one of the expositions at Geology Park. Had a headline that said "A famous Tennessee shrine," and this may have been. You have to keep in mind that the New York Times at the time was controlled by Adolph Fox, who used to work for Parson Brownlow, back in the work for people who worked for Parson Brownlow at least back in the 1860s and 70s. It says the Brownlow home is a mecca for every person of eminence who visits that part of Tennessee. Anyway, it's not there anymore. And I think there used to be a plaque when I was a kid. There was a plaque what was then Mulvaney Street that talked about that it was near here. And I think we ought to try to find that plaque. I don't know what happened to it. It was a state historic plaque that just vanished at some point. But other states that were mentioned, out-of-town newspapers, other historic sites, people will mention the Sevier Grave, the obelisk that's still on the courthouse lawn. It was remarked on by Teddy Roosevelt when he was in here in Knoxville. Sevier used to show up in histories that people read in school, so a lot of people come here and want to see the Sevier Grave. The Farragut Cabin. The Farragut Cabin was reputed to be the birthplace of David Glasgow Farragut, the Union admiral who was showed his heroic mettle in both New Orleans and Mobile. But it was moved from his birthplace at Lowe's Ferry, which had been marked with a grand pageant by Admiral Dewey in 1900. Admiral Dewey, who had worked with Farragut during the Civil War and was the hero of the Spanish-American War. But he went out there with a flotilla of steamboats from downtown to Concord at Lowe's Ferry and put this marker in and got national attention. And unfortunately, the marker was obscured for a while and was finally moved over to the Farragut Town Hall, where it is not the Farragut birthplace, but it's better that it's saved than otherwise. It's been. His birthplace has been redeveloped by people who decided that they didn't want that history there. Anyway, this cabin, meanwhile, in the early 20th century, was moved to Chilhowie Park, where it eventually burned down, as almost everything at Chilhowie Park eventually burned down. But it was a feature, one of the attractions of the Exposition era in the early 20th century. Speaking of Chilhowie Park and the Expositions, we had expositions there in 1910, 1911, 1913. These, here's Chilhowie Park from that era. And I think people had been to the St. Louis World's Fair, the Chicago World's Fair before that, and wanted to do something like that here in Knoxville, and did, I think, succeeded to some degree. Knoxville, interestingly though, a lot of people came to these expositions. We had, show the next one, Paul. Yeah, here's one from 1910. Watson's Bicycle Act, of course, a stereoscopic image. This is like a Viewmaster type image of this interesting feat. And in the rear is the great big building, sometimes known as the Liberal Arts Building, which was later replaced by the Jacob Building after it burned down. But this was one of several astonishing acts over the water that's still there of Chilhowie Park. But the biggest event ever at Chilhowie Park was in 1913, the National Conservation Exposition. More than 1 million people from all over the country came here. And I've done some research into that, looked some scanning of newspaper headlines about this. And one thing, interesting thing, this was in some ways kind of the counterpart of the World's Fair in the early 20th century. In fact, it's sometimes even listed as a World's Fair in some lists on Google that you find, because it was such a big deal. But it was we didn't have international pavilions there, but had state pavilions, and it was bigger than some World's Fairs, in fact, in terms of attendance. But it was people would ride the electric streetcar from downtown there, would stay in the hotels downtown. But it was one thing I've noticed in looking at newspaper accounts of this is that almost all the accounts of Knoxville are positive, even in New York and the places that were used to making fun of us. They said, you ought to go to Knoxville. It's really an interesting city. There are lots of things to see there. And many of them at this time mentioned Parson Brownlow's house and mentioned Fort Sanders and mentioned the National Cemetery and things that people from the North would be interested in seeing. But this was the biggest tourist event in Knoxville before the 1982 World's Fair anyway. Other things that people were interested in include, from that era, include the Gay Street Bridge, which was built in 1898. Now, I want to quote from this, the same Ohio tourist I mentioned earlier, from 1898, from Xenia, Ohio. One of the features, and this was published in the Ohio papers, one of the features of interest is their elegant new bridge over the Tennessee River, just being completed by the Youngstown, Ohio Bridge Company. They are justly proud of it. Anyway, that was one new thing. It was an impressive bridge at the time. Several people described it as elegantly cantilevered or whatever, but it was anyway. Another one was the Market House in Market Square, and this was described by lots of here, yeah, I'm sorry, the Women's Building was in the middle there. We can talk about that. This was built there, rather moved there, and after the Centennial Exposition in Nashville, and this was actually originally the Knoxville Pavilion, but it was moved by a bunch of women's groups to Knoxville and set up on Main Street, and became a women's building where they had dances and gallery exhibits and lectures and musical recitals and had artist studios in there. It was just a great thing, and I'm sorry it burned down in 1906 or so. But this is mentioned on some tourist lists of things to see in Knoxville. This was right across the street from the courthouse on Main Street. But also the Market Square and the Market House, and this was when it was brand new. It's interesting. The Ohio tourist said it would be quite interesting to some of our folks in Ohio to attend a Saturday morning market here. And I'm glad, this is in 1898, I'm glad we still have Saturday morning markets. If you would find perhaps 100 country wagons, with each as a tall, lank mountaineer, and with half of them a woman. But in 1902, someone else wrote that the Market House is the pride of Knoxville and one of the neatest and most attractive of its kind in the South. Neatest and most attractive is not what I hear people are older than me and remember the Market House as. I think it was not described that way in the 1940s and 50s and 60s, early 60s. It was torn down in 1960. But anyway, this is the Market House, and in its time, built in 1897, it was an interesting amenity and to some people a wonder. So it's been there a long time. I'm glad the buildings on the left side, like the Peter Kern building, are still intact. Next one, please. All right. One thing about you see in a lot of descriptions of Knoxville are mentions of natural beauty, often from a great distance. The mountains are often mentioned in passing, at least in passing. A 1902 description recommends places to see them, and they don't mention going into the mountains. They say you can see them from Mabry's Hill, which is where the Mabry Hazen House is. You can see it from Reservoir Hill, which is where Green School is, off of Summit Hill Drive in downtown Knoxville, more or less. And there are places you could see them in various hills in South Knoxville, they said. But these are places that you could see the mountains. The mountains were to be held from a distance and not to be visited by the standards of those times. They were hard to get to, and it might require some trespassing and being shot at and that sort of thing. But you could see them safely from Knoxville. That was the extent of visiting the mountains in those days. There was some rivalry with Chattanooga, which was already developing as a tourist attraction, both for its battlefields, famous battlefields, Missionary Ridge, and all that, but also the beauty of Lookout Mountain. The Brooklyn Times Union in Brooklyn, 1895, referenced Knoxville's response to Chattanooga's claims of beauty. This is their quote of a Knoxvillian responding to people talking about how beautiful Chattanooga is. Yes, the beautiful Lookout Mountain is superb, and you should see the view from our hills around here. And then you must remember that our climate is not to be compared for salubriousness with that of the town under Lookout Mountain, meaning Chattanooga. Why, the yellow fever never gets as high as this, talking about Knoxville. So they're saying, yeah, go see Chattanooga, but you might get yellow fever. But you can't just stay in Knoxville and enjoy the mountains from our distance. But other things, we had some more beauty up closer to town, and one of them was called Lion's View. And this is a place that named for its view. And we have This is the earliest image of it, a beautiful early landscape by a Scottish artist named David Cameron. There's Fred Moffat at UT, retired professor of art, recently wrote a book about David Cameron and was talking about what an interesting career he had. This was toward the end of his artistic career. He eventually gave up art, but he did several different. I think he did 4 different versions of this piece, which you can see. One of the originals at the KMA, but this is Lions View, looking kind of down toward where the river bends more to the south, about not too far from where the Conley Castle was there until recently. That Belle Isle is what he calls that island, and I think that the descendant of that island is still there. This view has been painted by other artists over the years. I think Hugh Tyler took a crack at it, but it's a beautiful spot. But I want to mention one famous tourist who's actually here on business. I don't know if he counts as a tourist, but while he was here, he wanted to have a look around. Wallace Stevens, one of the most famous modernist American poets, was in Knoxville in 1918, and working here as an attorney on business downtown. But while he was here, he decided to walk out. He'd heard of Lions View and wanted to walk out and see Lions View. And he wrote back in a letter to his wife. He said, out near the golf club, Cherokee Country Club golf course was already there at that time. At the western end of the city, there's really a swank view. The Tennessee River makes a great bend through the woods and cliffs and hills, and on the horizon run the blue ridges of the mountains. I saw no end of irises in people's gardens. There were peonies, tulip trees, locust trees, and an unknown tree, very large and spreading, colored with purple blossoms. I wonder if that was a redbud or something. But I found lots of motherly old hens guiding their broods of bears through the grass, already deep. And of course, I saw many boys and girls, both black and white, lounging in pleasant places. I feel quite sure I like Knoxville. Now, the fact that he mentioned the blue ridges of the mountains, which you can see in this painting, is relevant because this is very near the site where there was the home of industrialist Willis Davis and his very resourceful wife, Annie Davis. And I'll talk about them in a minute. But this was, I want to mention this at the time that people were getting away from the idea of railroads as the main source of travel and getting over toward automobiles. I think Wallace Stevens got here on the railroad, and so he was limited to getting around on foot and on the streetcar. But by 1914, there was an announcement of a major national event project called the Dixie Highway. This was something of which Knoxville was going to be central, and we have this is an early picture of the Dixie Highway here in Knoxville, the Dixie Highway garage there on the right. This is probably 1925 or so, but this is this was announced as a national way for people to get around the country, rather than just going down dirt roads and trying to find your way here and there. They were going to start building national highways. Dixie Highway went from the upper Midwest down to Florida. People would drive on vacation from Chicago to Miami or elsewhere in Florida. And about halfway down was Knoxville, and they would often stay here. And that was kind of the beginning of our kind of motel business, was all these thousands of cars coming through Knoxville going down the Dixie Highway. Well, that wasn't enough. Right after the Dixie Highway was announced, they announced State Route 1, which was a state highway that went from Bristol to Memphis, and it aligned with Dixie Highway in Knoxville, especially on Kingston Pike. And then Lee Highway in 1919, which connected Washington, D.C. to New Orleans. And it also connected to these other highways on this 20 miles west of Knoxville on Kingston Pike. And that was why suddenly we had a big tourist business on Kingston Pike, with lots and lots of tourist courts and restaurants. The amazing thing about automobiles compared to trains, they could stop anywhere. So you could put a restaurant anywhere along the highway, and you might get some business. This was this is kind of an exciting new thing. But this was, many people enjoyed to stay in Knoxville even when they were bound other places. But there are several places. We looked into this in great detail in our Bearden book, Historic Bearden, which came out a couple years ago. Some of you have gotten to see that book, but we kind of try to track the whole history of the tourism business, which started with farmers just letting tourists camp out on their farms and maybe use the bathroom now and then, but if they had one, and then kind of evolving into the tourist courts and then evolving into motels as we know them. But here's the Highlands Grill. A lot of these hotels that popped up were made to appeal to travelers from the north, and travelers from the north, having come to the south, want something southern, and a lot of these places had kind of a southern theme. Like they get some fried chicken and country ham when you get to come to Tennessee. Of course, the Highlands Grill, the building is still there today. I'm sorry the effort to restart it as Highlands Grill a few years ago didn't last indefinitely, but the building is still there. And here's a Highland Court, another tourist court along the way there along in Bearden area. But there were lots and lots of these. I think there were probably 13, 14 motels just in Bearden between what we know as the intersection of Lions View and North Shore. There were just motel after motel and tourist court after tourist court down there. Tourist courts were kind of just a step up from camping because you had your own little cabin and might share a bathroom or a shower or something like that in the middle. But an interesting era that lasted only maybe 15 or 20 years at its height, at least. Next one, please. All right, here's a little bit later. I don't know if anybody remembers this. I do not. This was actually in the late 50s, at the very end of this tourist era on Kingston Pike, and you see Mayo's in the background. Mayo's has not changed in 60-something years, and it's exactly the same looking front of that marble front of Mayo's is still the same. But this was an amusement park that was across the street from Mayo's that was appealing to this tourist traffic coming down Kingston Pike. It lasted only 2 or 3 or 4 years, I think. It had a swimming pool and some other kind of bells and whistles. But this was kind of the very beginning of the end for tourism on Kingston Pike, because everything was moving to I-40, not too far away, and the hotels were moving to the interstate exits rather than down the highways. But it was still, if not booming, it was still doing good business at that time. But next one, please. All right, here's, we're backing up a little bit. The old Farragut Hotel, now known as Hyatt Place, was built in 1919, again, to replace the burned down Imperial Hotel. And this was a much bigger hotel. Lots of famous people have stayed there. The New York Yankees with Ruth and Gehrig stayed there more than once in the 1930s. All sorts of interesting things have happened there. President Diem of South Vietnam and his retinue were there in the 50s, but a great deal of history behind that hotel, is the case with all old urban hotels, I think. But that was the best hotel after the Atkin Hotel. Remember the Atkin Hotel was still here when they built the Farragut, and they competed for 30 or 40 years. But then there was another hotel built right after that. Things started changing after the Farragut Hotel, and the reason they started changing is that all this coincided with the creation of a new automobile destination here. And Paul, are the Davises the next one? Yeah, I'm glad I guessed correctly on that. We had automobiles, and suddenly we could go places that trains didn't go. And there was one train that used to go to the Smokies. It was kind of slow and unreliable and just went to one place. But as soon as people had cars, people were really fascinated with the Smokies. In fact, the Knoxville Automobile Club led the charge to make a national park out of the Smokies. And the rise of the automobile coincided with Annie Davis, the lady on the left who lived on Lions View and could see the Smokies, with her proposal in 1923 to make the Smokies a national park. This was her her idea, at least the last articulation of it began with her initiative. And Willis Davis, her husband, did a lot to help her. But she was actually elected to the state legislature from Knoxville, one of the first women from Knoxville to be elected to public office, and devoted her 2 years in the state legislature to furthering the cause of getting the state to help establish this as a national park. A lot of different components went into this, including state funding, but also Rockefeller funding and other sources. But and lots of donors from Knoxville too, because they thought the Smokies was going to change Knoxville forever. Here's an early picture of the Smokies. I guess probably taken by is that a Jim Thompson picture, Paul? Yeah. But this was Knoxville just began looking away from itself and looking toward the Smokies, and more. Knoxville began kind of touting itself as the gateway to the Smokies. I began looking into this. Other cities had previously called themselves the gateway in modest ways. Wallen did for a while in 1911 or so, and Kensal Springs did, Bryson City, North Carolina, gateway to the Smokies. But it really in 1925 it began coalescing in a big way, and there was a lot of energy behind this. By 1925, a lot of people were saying that Knoxville was going to be the gateway to the Smokies. And this was going to be, what does that mean? It means that people would come here and stay in hotels in Knoxville and then go to the Smokies in cars, the next day perhaps. But in July of 1925, Judge Hugh Tate said to the Civitan Club, he said, Knoxville is situated in the midst of a section of unparalleled natural resources. And if this great national park project is put over, and I believe it will be, Knoxville will be the gateway, the very threshold of one of the most magnificent scenic parks or natural playgrounds in the world. And this is not too much overstating what actually happened. This was a major catalyst for lots of things in Knoxville, including art and artists. A lot of Charles Crouch began marketing his paintings of the Smokies, and a lot of other artists. They would have whole gallery shows of local artists doing paintings of the Smokies. This had never happened before this era. And the Knoxville baseball team, which had been called the Pioneers, was suddenly called the Smokies for the first time ever as they were developing the national park. Even like Highland Memorial Cemetery, as we found when we did the Bearden book, when they established Highland Cemetery in the 1920s, they boasted of, you can see the Great Smoky Mountains National Park from here. And they were saying that in like 1925, before there were trails cut and a lot of stuff done in the park. But by the late 20s, there were hundreds, if not thousands, of people already visiting the park. Among them, Will Rogers and people were Clarence Darrow. Other people went up to the Smokies just to see the area. And naturally, it propelled lots of speculation in hotels in Knoxville. The most impressive of which was the Andrew Johnson Hotel, which was built in 1929, right at the top of the great anticipation of the Smokies, which was at a time when it was already being visited by visitors. And Paul, we have a picture of the Andrew Johnson from that time, don't we?
We do, Jack, but we're not quite ready for it. And we've got Norris next.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I forgot. I imposed on Paul to include a picture of Norris Dam, which was completed and begun in 1933, completed in 1936, and this was one of the big sites that people wanted to see when they came to Knoxville. It wasn't the biggest dam in the world, but it was the first TVA dam, and it was very stylish. It was a very beautiful dam. And people wanted to see it. So many people came to see Norris Dam, from Eleanor Roosevelt to Ernie Pyle, the famous columnist and correspondent, was here several times. He loved Norris Dam. He described it being built for his national Scripps Howard column. Who else? Jean-Paul Sartre came here, believe it or not, during World War II. To see Norris Dam, and also went to Fontana Dam when he was writing about the American war effort for the Paris, for the French papers. but this was a secondary tourist draw, so much so that that I think we can say that it's likely Knoxville might not be the headquarters of Tennessee Valley Authority if not for the fact that Norris Dam was deemed to be the first dam built there. They wanted to be sure that they had the headquarters close enough to this dam that they could show it off to lots and lots of people. Jawaharlal Nehru and his daughter, who would be known as Indira Gandhi, came here and visited Norris Dam. It's incredible the number of tourists, if you want to call them that, who came to see this, to behold Norris Dam. Also, Le Corbusier, they say the great architect from Switzerland, came to see Norris Dam, and some people claim that everything that Corbusier did after he saw Norris Dam looked like Norris Dam. So he loved concrete in massive quantities. But anyway, yeah. But that's something to keep in mind, that not just the Smokies, but Norris Dam and eventually the other dams were part of Knoxville's tourist draw. What's the next one, Paul? All right, what happened to the anyway? Yeah, the World's Fair, I guess, was the next one that.
Jack, do you want to go to the Andrew Johnson?
Yeah, if did we skip over it or something, or
maybe we had Crouch, right? You mentioned Crouch, and then if you want to hang on that for a minute.
Sure. Yeah, sure. Yeah. Here's the hotel that was built in the early days. In fact, when it was finished, the Smokies weren't really officially open as a national park. Well, some people say 1934, but they had a ranger and trails and things in 1930, and a lot of actual park planners considered it open for business in 1930. But people were going there in late 1920s, 1929, when the Andrew Johnson was completed. This was the biggest hotel ever built in Knoxville. It was air conditioned eventually, at least, and it had at one time it had a pool in that terraced area down toward the bottom. But it was a hotel that has a really great legacy of lots and lots of people, interesting people visiting Knoxville and staying there, including, I mentioned earlier, Jean-Paul Sartre, when he was doing his tour of America and the American war effort. He stayed at the Andrew Johnson for several days and apparently wrote an essay called American Cities, in which he talked about how American cities seem to be rotting from the core, and for the French publication Le Figaro. But who else? Amelia Earhart, the legendary flyer. Okay, here's some of those folks. Odette Coyne, who was a Belgian journalist. She was a well-known writer in her own right, but she was a lot of people remember her for the fact that she was H.G. Wells' longtime lover. But she wrote a book about the Tennessee Valley Authority, in which she does not. She's very impressed with TVA, but very unimpressed with Knoxville. But she was one of these visitors who came through, and she actually spent a whole summer here looking around. It probably one of our low points. One of the ironies is that Knoxville, just as we were developing the Smoky Mountains and Norris Dam and all these amazing things just outside of town, the town itself was sooty and had a lot of garbage and a lot of things neglected here. Amelia Earhart, who was actually decided that she wanted to drive solo through the Smoky Mountains. She was always ever the daredevil at a time when the roads weren't very good through the mountains, but she drove through the mountains in 1937, I think, just a few months before her disappearance, and it got around that Amelia Earhart was staying at the Andrew Johnson just as a tourist, and some reporter mentioned it, and finally she realized it got around, and finally she realized she had to give a press conference in her hotel room. And then during that press conference, she said that, I really don't expect to be an old woman. I love what I do too much, but I really I like to take chances, and she did. Anne Marie Schwarzenbach stayed there when she came to town in 1938. She was a writer from Switzerland, and a fascinating woman. Wrote a book called Jenseits von New York in German, which has never been translated into English. that I know of, but in which he describes Knoxville in some detail. And of course, Jean-Paul Sartre, who was here, and he stayed at the Andrew Johnson as well. So, but that's just a quick look at there's a long list of fascinating people, of course, including Hank Williams and others. But these are just some interesting tourists of that kind of the early exciting years of the Andrew Johnson. Next one, please. All right. We had some literary tourists over the years, and I know people like Larry McMurtry, for example, is one of the best known, but not just one of many people who come looking for the place that James Agee wrote about, and Knoxville Summer 1915, and also the associated novel, autobiographical novel, A Death in the Family. This was his home on Highland Avenue, which ironically was being torn down just as they were filming the first of 4 movies based on that book in 1963, the one with Robert Preston. But this was this site is still, people still want to go to the 1500 block of Highland to see the place, and I'm glad some of the houses that he described and not some 1915 are still there. This is not anything to compare with the other tourist sites we've talked about, but this literary tourism is a real thing, and I've actually gotten to deal with a lot of these folks come to town and they want to go to and stand in the place. C-SPAN did a thing about this block about 10 years ago, and got to show them where it was and all that. But I've met a couple dozen people who've come to Knoxville saying, gosh, I want to see where James Agee lived, where the house is still there or not. But other literary tourists come here to see Cormac McCarthy stuff, and I've talked to people who come from as far as Australia to see all the places described in Cormac McCarthy's Suttree. And we have that picture of Harrogate's. Yeah, this is the place where Gene Harrogate lived in Suttree, his retreat, as it's called in the book, underneath the Hill Avenue Viaduct. And that building on the left is the Craighead Jackson House. This is almost in the backyard of the Craighead Jackson House. And I had an Australian scholar, is the only person I've known of who actually ever climbed into that place. That door kind of looks like an antique door, but it was only installed about 5 years ago to keep vagrants out. It'd always been a place where vagrants lived, even back to the early 50s when Suttree is set. So I want to mention these because we're doing our literary guide, a walking guide to downtown Knoxville, Knoxville's literary sites, and we have a lot of stuff from James Agee, Cormac McCarthy, Nikki Giovanni, Francis Houser Burnett, George Washington Harris, David Madden, lots of people who've written about downtown Knoxville, and have quotes from these writers that you can take to each of these places and see what they look like today. By the way, well-known NPR journalist Steve Inskeep was in town, and he really wanted to see this place. It turns out that he could quote long portions of Suttree, and he'd given a book signing at the Bijou, and I said, well, it's not too far from here. Let's go down there, and we actually walked down here at 11 o'clock at night or so to see Harrogate's Lair, as we call it. Next one, please. All right. I guess we're here in present time, but we have a World's Fair shot or two, right? So any other pictures we haven't shown yet? Yeah, here we go. Knoxville was not always the gateway to the Smokies, and by the 1960s and 70s, it was obvious that a lot of that Smokies energy with tourists that used to help populate hotels both downtown and also on Chapman Highway was moving to Sevier County as Pigeon Forge developed, and Gatlinburg got even busier, and Sevierville had its own attractions. So I think people started saying, gosh, what are we going to do now? And they said, well, let's have a World's Fair. There was an idea that came out in 1974. We've written a lot about the World's Fair this year and talked about that. And I encourage you, we have some of our work online. You can read 1982 World's Fair. In hindsight, a long piece that I wrote about the legacy of the World's Fair, which I think is greater than it was the first time I did a story about the legacy of the World's Fair back in '97. But this was a big deal. I mean, and people say, oh, it wasn't this or that, but this was the most popular World's Fair in America in the post-war era, after the 1930s, after the big World's Fairs of '39 in San Francisco and New York. Except for the New York World's Fair in '64, which was a non-compliant World's Fair. They didn't want to go by the rules, so they had they had their own thing that they called a World's Fair. But this was over 11 million people came to this thing. That's even bigger than Seattle in '62 with the Space Needle and all that. So this is something definitely significant in our history that kind of compensate for the fact that we lost passenger service on the trains in 1970, and we weren't gateway to the Smokies anymore. Suddenly we had this crazy Hail Mary pass to do something different, and even if it didn't have the aftermath that many of us hoped would, with immediate kind of construction jobs and that sort of thing that were going to enliven downtown forever after the fair. Still, it's something very interesting in our past, and I think what's happened on that site is mostly positive, very positive down there. It's a fascinating place to wander around today and to show tourists today. But in hindsight, it's significant. We look at it, the fact that China, the first time China had ever been to a World's Fair, as People's Republic of China in history, and how symbolic that was of China's kind of making a one step out into the Western world that they now dominate in some ways. But also the European Union had their first pavilion at a World's Fair, at the World's Fair. And also I once made fun of the fact, I'm embarrassed, in 1997, the fact that touchscreen computers was hailed as a big thing at the World's Fair, even though a lot of reporters didn't notice it. I thought, what good are these ever going to be? Because what's the matter with knobs and buttons? But obviously, we all have one of these cell phone contraptions in our pockets, and we take it for granted today. But it was introduced to a lot of people at the World's Fair. So this was a fascinating and unexpected thing to happen in Knoxville. And of course, Mr. Bart Simpson had his own experience with the World's Fair, with the episode that many of you have seen, I'm sure. But I'm glad it's not that episode is not strictly accurate in how they portray Knoxville. But anyway, what do we have to go here, Paul? I want to talk about this because, like a lot of you have noticed, we have a lot of tourists in downtown today, and this is kind of fascinating to me. And you can tell they're tourists because they're taking pictures of the buildings, the buildings that most of us ignore most of the time. Here's a guy down at the bottom just looking up at these buildings. There are people speaking French and German and Arabic on the streets of downtown Knoxville. What are they here for? And I actually consulted with our friend and often partner Kim Bumpus at Visit Knoxville. And it's not any one thing, she says, but Knoxville's gotten a lot of really good press in recent years. And she said, besides the traditional conventions and sporting events, we are on the map as a premier getaway destination. Leisure travelers are coming here for a 2 to 4 night stay just to hang out, eat, go to our attractions, have outdoor adventure and nightlife. Downtown Knoxville is, not all cities have something like we have in downtown Knoxville. And it's a fairly easy place to just enjoy. I was talking to a friend of mine who lives in Boston. He was here for big ears back in the spring. And he said, Boston's a big city. He said, but there's no place in Boston that's like downtown Knoxville that has so many different things within such a short distance that you can walk to them really easily. So many bars, so many restaurants, a bowling alley, so many venues, really good venues. He was impressed with our venues here. He's a jazz critic, and that's why he was at big ears. But it's we have an attractive city here, and there, Laura mentions they do take take her walking tours as well. But this is Knoxville's earned a lot of good press in the travel industry, but including features in the New York Times, and also its restaurants. Just lately, I heard that Brother Wolf got listed as one of the best bars in America, I think, something like that, and by Esquire magazine. Dopo got some national plaudits as one of the best pizza places in America. J.C. Holdway has gotten national attention. So all these restaurants, we used to make fun of our restaurants, but these are restaurants that are getting people's attention. Amelia's gotten some national attention. But also venues, our venues, especially during Big Ears. And I think Big Ears, even though it's not one of our biggest festivals in terms of people, Big Ears has a lot of really interesting writers who come to Big Ears in Knoxville, and they write about Knoxville after Big Ears. And I think a lot of this press has been generated by Big Ears, indirectly, by them writing in the New York Times or the Rolling Stone or the LA Times or even the London Times about Knoxville. And people can pick up on this and say, I've never been there. Let's go down there and get a hotel and stay there for a while. But anyway, that's my quick tour of tourism in Knoxville. I probably left out a lot, but there's a lot there to talk about. If there are any questions at all, I would be happy to take them. Questions or comments. All right, well, I've carried on. Goodness, I didn't have a watch with me, and I can't see my computer clock when I thought it was probably about 7 o'clock. But I appreciate your hanging in there and putting off supper for just long enough to hear our stories and stay in touch, everybody. We really appreciate you coming out. And thanks again to Paul for his excellent image research, and to Nicole for her technical capabilities and hosting this. So really appreciate it. Thanks.